welcome you all. It's a very special moment for us to be together in this room here, like in a classroom, seeing you all on one screen. My name is Gábor Kársai, Managing Director of Mind and Life Europe, and I would like to welcome you all on this special occasion, as this is the first time Mind and Life Europe is organizing and creating a classical university type of course like this for students and for learners, for explorers who would like to study a very specific theme or topic. And my main motivation for being here is related to my role as an educator in a university, always finding excitement and deep meaning in developing something new, a new course, a new subject, or a new way of exploring themes and ideas and thoughts. And the development of the Core Enaction program was one of the most exciting program that I could participate in together with with Amy Varela, who is here with us, and I'm going to hand over the baton to her soon, and also the whole organizing committee who will be introduced later in the program. It's a real honor, a real privilege, and a real joy for me to be here and to see you all. And thank you so much for taking the time and the energy to investigate further what the enactive approach means, what it meant in the history, and what it means today and in the future. Amy.
Thank you very much, Gábor. Welcome, everyone. I'm very, very happy and excited to see all your faces on the screen today. So as Gábor said, you know, Mind and Life Europe is dedicated to the idea of making really substantial intellectual and scientific offerings to the public. Some of you might know that in 2021, we had what we called the 2030 year, where we commemorated the 20 years of Francisco's passing and the 30th anniversary of publication of the Embodied Mind. And during all the events that we did in 2021, we learned a lot from participants about what they want and about what they need. So we'd already started thinking about doing a more sustained kind of course, doing something more in a kind of sustained course format. But during the Ouroboros series and the Francisco and Friends series in 2021, we became aware of the demand for the study of enaction that was coming from a diversity of people, from philosophers to scientists to artists, people with all sorts of different practices. So with this course, we're aiming to give you a solid scaffolding for your understanding of this particular type of cognitive science. And so for my motivation, as an ex-literary student and a still literary lover, I think it's really crucial that we examine our metaphors and our framings in the way we think about things, including about cognition and about mind. And particularly cognition and mind, framings and metaphors that break from the computer metaphor, from the computational metaphor. The mind is a computer. This is the predominant metaphor that's in function today for the larger public and for scientists as well. I think we need to shift metaphors. I think I could even say that even our survival on a healthy planet may be dependent on us being capable of making this kind of shift in framing in metaphor. And as I see it personally, and through my contacts with many of you, and lots of different people who are working in the enactive realm, I see it as an alternative view that breathes life back into mind, actually, by bringing life and mind back to where they started, which is in a continuum. So I hope this course will breathe some fresh air into your mind as well. Now I'm going to pass the baton to Johanna Magan, who is our Mind and Life Europe program director, and she will be accompanying us throughout this whole adventure. So to you, Johanna.
Thank you so much, Amy, for that really substantive and spirited introduction, which resonates really well with the reasons why I'm personally happy to be a part of this project. So as Amy mentioned, I'm the programs manager at Mind and Life Europe, and so I'll be on board with all of you for all of the sessions of this semester and also all of the future semesters as a sort of common thread, both to provide a sort of pedagogical container for the experience and also hopefully to offer some sense of continuity across different sessions and also across the 4 semesters. So my background as a researcher and professor prior to joining MLE was really at the crossroads of literature and science, specifically early modern French literature and early modern science. So I'm also quite new to this particular material, at least the contemporary expression of this material. And so I'm keen to also be in a sort of student seat with all of you and to offer some facilitation and moderation wherever needed. So with that, I think I will pass the baton to our wonderful organizing team. So starting with Valérie Bonardel, and then John Protevi, and then Luisa Damiano. And I also do want to make mention that we have 2 of our other faculty members in the room. If you just want to wave, we have Dr. Bruce Clark, and we have Dr. Juan Carlos Letelier, who are also joining us for the first session, and they'll be giving us lectures on the origins of cybernetics in the following sessions. So Valérie, maybe I can pass the baton to you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you, Amy and Gabor, to make this to happen. I've probably been waiting for that sort of event to happen for the last 10 years. I used to be, so very quickly, because I know that our time is short. I have been done my PhD under Francisco Varela supervision, but at the time it was on color. It's only later that I discovered the Embodied Mind, and this was very important in the sense that during my career I was led to teach cognitive psychology to students, and the computer metaphor, as Amy has mentioned, is extremely frustrating. So basically, I think the concept that were laid out 30 years ago with the Embodied Mind are fundamental to be brought up to the contemporary teaching of cognitive science. So this is the reason why I'm here, because actually there is very little in the mainstream syllabus in psychology, and we have now an urgency actually to start to talk about the circulation between the science of mind, cognitive science, and the human experience. So I'm glad that we start today. And also I should say that I will be teaching for semester 2.
Okay, John, would you like to take over?
Sure. My name is John Protevi. Can you all hear me? Okay. I teach in Louisiana at Louisiana State University. I have a joint appointment in the French department and the philosophy department, although my training is in philosophy. So I've done work in the history of philosophy early, and then for a long time I did Derrida. But for the last 15 or 20 years, it's been Deleuze and Foucault, and oddly enough, trying to intersect with inaction and the enactive paradigm. So that's my background, and so I will. I guess I'm going to teach some session on autopoiesis in this semester, and then in the spring I'll help with the embodied mind.
Thank you. And so finally we'll move to Luisa Damiano, who will introduce herself and will also be offering the most substantive part of the program this evening, which will be her presentation coming up.
So, hello, I'm Luisa Damiano. I'm trying to share my screen. One second. Okay, so I'm an associate professor of philosophy of science at the University of Milan. For many years, I work on approaches to the description of cognitive processes and the cognitive mind that belong to the genealogy of the enactive approach, and also on the enactive approach. And this is the reason why I will host this first season of the Core Enaction series. And I wanted to present my motivation for being here, for participating to this project. One of my motivation, maybe the main motivation in these moments, through these slides, in which I also quote Francisco Varela. And I think that to address in a generative way the current crisis, as also Amy mentioned before, crises that are spanning from the ecological crisis to geopolitical crisis, we need also not only, but also significantly a cognitive transformation, because all these crises are also have also a cognitive dimension, are also cognitive crisis of a way of thinking and also a way of doing science. And I tend to think that the enactive approach and related, genealogically related approach that we will explore in the Core Enaction series and in this genealogy season of the Core Enaction series can foster a new way of thinking, a new, a systemic and integrative way of thinking, and at the same time a culture and a science of responsibility. And I tend to think that Francisco Varela was already seeing things in this direction in the late 70s, when, for example, in Principles of Biological Autonomy was writing that every unity that can be called a knower constructs the world it knows, and in doing so determines its way of knowing. And the predominance of the ideas of control and information as representation has led philosophy, science, and technology into the attitude that has persistently kept man, the philosopher and the scientist, out of his own doing, fostering the belief that in the last analysis, he was not responsible for the world he came to know and to manipulate. So, and on this basis, I am very happy to welcome you to this first part of the Core Enaction series, and to this, which is dedicated to construct together and explore together a genealogy for the enactive approach, which we consider, with the words of Francisco Varela, an exercise of creative foresight. In the sense that what we are trying to do with this first part of the Core Enaction series dedicated to the genealogy of the enactive approach is accepting an invitation from Francisco Varela that is distributed in all his writings. And I think is particularly clear in this fragment that is extracted from the preface he wrote for a book of philosophy dedicated to the genealogy of early embodiment approaches, in which he says that what makes science open and creative is the reinterpretation of the original problems and approaches. And as some of the best scientists have pointed out, the reevaluation of the past of science is the best introduction to its future. And only by considering the earliest roots and revisiting the problem spaces, we can reach a fresh perspective on theoretical and conceptual tools. So our attempt here is that of applying Varela's unconventional way of doing science, is a genealogical approach to science, to Varela's scientific work, that is undertaking together an exploration of the origins of the enactive approach, exploring together the problem spaces from which this approach emerged, exploring its emergence, its evolution, to unfold as much as possible its potential, that is to stimulate, to catalyze, to prepare future developments, generative future developments for this approach, transformative affiliations for this approach. So the idea is that of an exercise of creative foresight, as he was calling these genealogical explorations, applied to Varela's path towards the enactive. enactive approach. And the path that we can consider as a very innovative, very flexible, self-transformative, transdisciplinary research path on life and cognition that combines many different disciplines, from biology to neuroscience to philosophy, in particular epistemology, to mathematics, contemplative sciences. And in particular, our genealogy season will focus on 3 aspects of this path. That is the cybernetic origins of the enactive approach, and then the parts and the dimensions of this path that were dedicated to the development of autopoiesis with Umberto Maturana between the 70s and the 80s mainly. And then the parts and the dimensions of this path dedicated to the development of the theory of autonomous systems from the late 70s to the 90s, where all these segments of this path, all these dimensions of this path converged in preparing elements that are very relevant for the development of the enactive approach. And this interest for these 3 aspects of the genealogical path towards the enactive approach are reflected by the program of our genealogy season, which after this introductory session dedicated to offer a background overview, a sort of historical theoretical landscape of reference for the future sessions, plans to offer 2 sessions on the cybernetic origins of the enactive approach, one by Professor Bruce Clark and the other by Professor Juan Carlos Letelier. We are here with us this evening. 2 sessions on autopoiesis, one by Professor Tom Zinke and the other by Professor John Protevi. You met John a few minutes ago. And 2 sessions on Varela's theory of autonomous systems, one by Professor Ivan Thompson and one by Professor Valerie Bonardel, you met just now, and me and myself. And this will be a final session that will reorganize, rearticulate the contents of all the session and create a bridge towards the next season dedicated to the embodied mind. And the idea that we have for this genealogy season is that of articulating it around a participative approach. In each session, we will have presentations from an invited speakers, the professor I mentioned before, but also open discussions, because the idea is that of co-learning, learning together, exploring together, and deepening the comprehension of the contents, the theoretical contents that will be presented by integrating them into our experiences, into our lives, and through the discussion also into our research paths. So, and we'll start this participative path today by through a first overview of the 3 aspects of the genealogy of the enactive approach that we will explore in the next sessions. And that I mean the cybernetic origins of the enactive approach. And with regard to this, I will focus today mainly on the so-called cybernetics of networks, and then autopoiesis, and we'll briefly introduce also the theory of autonomous system, with the goal of describing basic elements of these 3 aspects of the genealogy of the enactive approach, with 2 focalizations. On one side, I would like to underline, to emphasize the deep interconnection between these aspects that can be considered different expressions of the same research tradition, a research tradition that Francisco Varela, through the words of the founder of this tradition, Warren McCulloch, was calling experimental epistemology. References to experimental epistemology are distributed in Francisco Varela's writing. And the enactive approach can be seen as one of the most accomplished expressions of this tradition. And the second focalization is on the convergence of these 3 segments of the genealogy of the enactive approach in a process of constructions of alternatives for classical cognitive science. And one of the most powerful alternatives I know for classical cognitive science is the enactive approach. And I would like to clarify what I mean for alternatives in this context by starting to providing a bit of background, and doing that through this scheme, let's say a very an hypersimplifying scheme describing the evolution of the cognitive sciences, which shows how cognitive science and AI emerged in the middle of the 50s of the last century, after what is considered called a decade, but could be a more extended period of time, that is usually conceived as the cybernetic foundation of the cognitive science. That is the work that the protagonists of the research realized in the context of the cybernetic movements, dedicated to prepare the experimental, the theoretical basis of an empirical and naturalistic science of cognitive processes. And their production was immense and very differentiated, and only a little part of this production solidified in the core of the first form assumed by cognitive science and AI that emerged at the birth of cognitive science and AI, that is usually called classical or computationalist cognitive science and AI. And it's called computationalist because classical cognitive science and AI refers to the model of the digital computer, von Neumann's computer, to describe us as cognitive agents. The idea is that cognitively we work as computers. We receive information from the environment, we process this information, and we generate internal images, representation, description of the environment that within this framework is conceived as a sort of independent external reality in which we are located. And on the basis of the correspondence between our internal representation and this external reality, we can address more or less successfully problems of adaptation, problems of interaction. And this framework is a framework that dominated research in the cognitive sciences and AI, at least until the middle of the 80s, in a certain sense, is still dominating. But around the middle of the 80s, we started to see a growing dissatisfaction towards this kind of this framework, this theoretical framework, for a variety of reasons that I don't have the time to explore today, but that are ranging from deep philosophical issues to applicative problems, like the problem of radically redefining the ambitions of classical cognitive science. In this period, we realized that the ambitions that were presented by the pioneers of classical AI, the ambition of having by the 80s computers capable of realizing the majority of our mental work, were ambitions that were out of reach. So this growing dissatisfaction implied the search for alternatives, and already at the end of the 80s, at the beginning of the 90s, started to emerge embodied cognitive science, what we call today embodied cognitive science, as a new form of cognitive science, called embodied because it tries to address the difficulties met by classical cognitive science and AI by posing a new positive emphasis on the role of the body in cognitive processes. Today, there is a lot of debate concerning the transition from computationalism to embodied cognitive science and AI. And part of this debate, an interesting part of this debate, is dedicated to understand if this transition can be considered a transition towards a genuine alternative for computationalism. And the question is generated also by the fact that embodied cognitive science and AI is a plural science constituted by many different research lines referring to different models to describe us as cognitive agents. And among these models, many models are still versions of the classical model of the digital computer, of von Neumann's computer, to which the proponents of embodied cognitive science and AI are imposing bodily and environmental constraints. So the fact that part and the mainstream of embodied cognitive science and AI is still referring to the model used by classical computation to describe us as cognitive agents, put in question the idea that embodied cognitive science and AI today can be considered a genuine alternative to computationalism. Anyhow, the literature converges in seeing a point of discontinuity between computationalism and embodied cognitive science and AI. which is described typically as a different approach to the description and, of the role of the body in cognitive processes. From the point of view of the proponents of embodied cognitive science and AI, computationalist is still seduced by the metaphysical, the philosophical, classical thesis of a material mind, a mind that is basically independent from the materiality of its realization, and so from its realization itself. The idea is that the thesis of the multiple realizability of the computational mind, thesis according to which we can conceive the computational mind as a software that can run equally well on different forms of hardware. One can be our brain, another can be the hardware of the computer, implies a form of functional dualism. That is the idea that with regard to its functioning, the computational mind is independent from the specificities of its material realization. And this is the aspect of computation that is typically rejected by the proponents of embodiment, also when they still refers to the classical model of the computer. And this discontinuity implies differences in the definition of the main research object of the cognitive science and the AI, and many other differences. But these differences are generating different kinds of alternatives on the basis of the kind of model that is used to describe us as cognitive agents and the different approaches that are built around this model. And the useful way to have an overview of the approaches that we have today in the context of embodied cognitive science and AI is the distinction, is using the distinction that what is introduced by Andy Clark, a philosopher of mind, at the end of the 90s, for a distinction concerning two main research directions in embodied cognitive science and AI that are still there. They are fragmented in many other research directions, but these two main research directions are still there, and Clark called them simple and radical embodiment. And for simple embodiment, he referred to the parts of embodied cognitive science and AI that are still referring to the model, the classical model of the computer, and they're imposing to this model bodily and environmental constraints, which we can consider, as I said, the mainstream of embodied cognitive science today, and which generates moderate alternatives to computationalism. And then we have radical embodiment, the radical embodiment direction, which rejects the model of the computer, introduces different models to describe us as cognitive agents, and so new concepts and new ways of defining the objects of the cognitive science. So in this sense, produces radical alternatives to computationalism. And the reasons at the basis of the rejection of the model of the computer is the idea that using this kind of model to describe natural cognitive system, that is biological cognitive system, is that this model eliminates from the scene of the inquiry of the cognitive sciences and the scene of the inquiry of AI when it tries to model natural cognitive system, the property that is distinguishing biological system from artifacts like the computer. That is the property of autonomy, the fact that the property that allows this system to produce themselves by themselves, to self-organize themselves, to produce themselves through metabolism and self-regulate themselves in interaction with the environment to maintain their own organization. And the idea that biological cognitive systems are autonomous systems implies that they have an organization that is completely different from that of an artifact as the computer is. And so using notions that are based on the model, the descriptive model of the computer to describe cognitive processes of belonging to natural cognitive systems is inadequate. In particular, the notions of computation and representation are considered inadequate by radical embodiment. And also the traditional way, the computationalist way, on the basis of this model, of the computer to define object in the domain of the cognitive processes is inadequate, and we need alternatives, radical alternatives capable of expressing better the dense interconnection for what concerns us, human agents, between our brain, our body, and environment. So it is in this sense that I talk about the production of alternatives to classical cognitive science in the context of the tradition of experimental epistemology. Alternatives that are articulated around the ascription to natural cognitive systems, to biological system, of the property of autonomy. So what's next in this introduction? I will go on in this introduction by proposing a short introduction about cybernetics. Then I will propose 5 minutes of break, a refreshing break, and then I will propose a short introduction related to concerning the cybernetic tradition of experimental epistemology, with a focus on 4 phases of this of its development. The foundation of this research tradition by Warren McCulloch, one of the fathers of cybernetics, and related work by McCulloch and Pitts, and I will focus particularly on these phases because we will not consider in detail these phases with the other sessions. Then I will consider second order cybernetic as a second phase of expression of the cybernetic tradition of experimental epistemology. Then I will focus on autopoiesis, and I will introduce the theory of autonomous system by Varela, focusing on some key aspects of the evolution given by these 4 phases of the tradition of experimental epistemology. The first aspect is the convergence of these different theoretical approaches in describing cognitive systems in terms of networks, and on this basis, the convergence is describing the cognitive mind as a process. And I will try to delineate how, with the evolution of this transition, we will switch from the thesis proposed by Warren McCulloch, according to which if we describe the cognitive mind as a process, we have to consider that the mind is in the head, we will switch towards different versions of the thesis according to which, if we describe the cognitive mind as a process, we cannot confine the cognitive mind to the head. And before the break, I would like to briefly introduce, as I announced, the movement of cybernetics, or the research area of cybernetics. And I will do that referring to the definition, the most famous definition of cybernetic, that is the definition given by Norbert Wiener in his book, in the book that he dedicated to cybernetics in 1948, Cybernetics, in which he defines this domain as the science of control and communication in the animal and the machine. And as this definition emphasizes, cybernetics is a transdisciplinary research area articulated around the bidirectional exchange of knowledge between 2 research domains that, as Wiener emphasizes in the book I was referring to, are, before the emergence of cybernetics, were separated by a disciplinary abyss, that is the technological domain of the production of artifacts on one side, and the biological domain dedicated to the naturalistic study of living systems, where this bidirectional exchange of knowledge in the context of cybernetics has a twofold goal. On one side, the goal is that of building better machines. The idea is that of incorporating in our machines our best theories of how processes of self-regulation and communication are realized in biological systems that are the most adaptive systems we know. And this is the idea of building better machine through the study of biological system and regulation and communication in these systems. But the idea is also, and the goal is also that of using these machines in which we incorporated these theories to test these theories by comparing the behaviors that of regulation and communication that are expressed by the machine we built in interaction with their environments with the behaviors of regulation and communication expressed by the target biological systems in such a way to study accurately the divergences between these behaviors to try to improve our hypothesis on regulation and communication in biological system, and to start again with this kind of synthetic study of these processes in biological systems. And as I said before, the movement of cybernetics, a movement that gathered specialists belonging to many different disciplines. Here, to give you an idea, we have Turing, Shannon, Shannon, von Neumann, Wiener, Ross, Walter Gray, but we have also Gregory Bateson, Warren McCulloch, Walter Pitts, Heinz von Förster, Margaret Mead, and Gordon Pask, just to give you an idea. So many different disciplinary backgrounds that are going from mathematics to psychiatry to anthropology to sociology and so on. And all these different specialists were working together to produce the basis of an empirical and naturalistic science of cognitive processes. And one of the ways in which they were interacting is given by the so-called Macy conferences, a series of conferences on cybernetics that were held between 1946 and 1953 at the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation in New York, chaired by Warren McCulloch, and conferences in which Heinz von Förster was serving as a general secretary based on the decision by McCulloch, where the goal was developing the basis of a general science of mind. And in the context of these conferences were produced and presented many of the fundamental theoretical basis for the cognitive science and the eye, such as the model of the networks of artificial neurons by McCulloch and Pitts, on which we will focus later, the functional analogy between the digital computer and the brain by von Neumann, that is at the basis of computationalism, the functional analogy between servomechanism and neurosystem by Norbert Wiener, that is at the basis of some aspects of the embodied cognitive science. And this quite diffused hypothesis, the hypothesis according to which it's in the first of these Macy conferences that cybernetics was the base of both the paradigms, both the forms of cognitive sciences I was mentioning before, computationalism and embodied cognitive science. Because in this first conference, Jon von Neumann presented the possibility of grounding cognitive science and the eye on the functional analogy between the computer he was drawing in those years and the brain, giving the basis to a computationalist cognitive science. And Wiener was presenting the hypothesis of the functional analogy between servomechanism, the mechanisms that are regulating the processes of production in machines, and the nervous system as an alternative possibility for the foundation of cognitive science and the eye, preparing some of the developments, and in particular embodied developments of the cognitive science. But the thesis I would like to propose today, and as a working thesis for the rest of this introductory session, is that elements at the basis of both these forms of cognitive science and the eye were proposed already by Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts during their collaboration. That was the collaboration that founded experimental epistemology. And in particular, what I will try to reconstruct today are segments of the path the evolutionary path of the tradition of experimental epistemology that led to the development of radically embodied approach to the description of cognitive processes by considering the foundation of experimental epistemology, the expression of this research tradition in second-order cybernetics, in autopoiesis, and in the theory of autonomous system by Francisco Varela. So as I promised, we have now 5 minutes of break, of refreshing break, so I will wait here to restart with this introduction. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Luisa. So we'll be back at 6:47, and we'd ask that everyone be back on time so we can keep with the schedule and we don't end late. Thanks.
So welcome back. It's 6:47, so okay, I start. I restart. Starting with our co-exploration, our first co-exploration of the 4 phases I indicated before of the tradition of experimental epistemology. And I would like to tell to who is not familiar with these topics that this is an exploration that tries to be general, but will go in some level of details. And the important thing is that of following the general lines of this genealogy of the enactive approach we are drawing to today, this overview, because we will get back in the next sessions to this the concept that we are presenting today, and also in particular in the last session. So we will get back to this topic. So no worries if you cannot follow everything in detail. So I will start considering the evolution of tradition of experimental epistemology from the foundation of this tradition by Warren McCulloch, a neurophysiologist who considered that he was not founding a tradition, but it was simply emphasized the presence of a research tradition that, according to him, was started by 2 other physiologists and neurophysiologists, Rudolf Magnus and Duce de Barren, with whom McCulloch worked. A research tradition that was characterized by combining neurophysiology and epistemology. And the idea was that of a research tradition addressing the classical question of philosophy of knowledge, and in this general sense of epistemology, by proposing explanations for this question, answered by generating answers for this question, elaborated in terms of plausible neurophysiological mechanisms. And explanation based on a form of study of neurophysiological mechanism at the basis of cognitive processes, mechanisms considered while they are functioning. And in this sense, according to McCulloch, mechanisms that have to be studied not through analysis, but through synthesis. The idea is that to dismiss the classical analytical method of science that requires scientists to dissect the systems they are studying, and to refer to a new research method, a new scientific research method that was adopted as official research method by cybernetics. That was the synthetic method I won't mention it before while introducing Wiener's view of cybernetics, where the proposal of the synthetic method for science is that of studying natural processes, and in particular biological and cognitive processes, lato sensu, through the construction and experimental exploration of artificial models of these processes. That is, as I anticipated before, incorporating in artifacts hypotheses, in the case of McCulloch, in this case of experimental epistemology, about plausible mechanisms on the generation in nature of cognitive processes, and then testing these hypotheses by comparing the behaviors that our artifacts are expressing in interaction with the environments we are including them, with the target system behaviors, in order to study the divergences between these behaviors. And when these divergences are not deriving from mistakes in the construction of the artificial models, the incorporation of our hypotheses in these artifacts, these divergences have the potential of making us improve our hypotheses and test them through another cycle of the synthetic method. And through the synthetic method and through the experimental epistemology approach, Warren McCulloch intended to work to a synthetic model of neuronal processes that he based on hypotheses developed on the basis of ideas of Turing's ideas on machine intelligence and Shannon's application of the Boolean algebra to electrical circuits, and in particular on the basis of 2 hypotheses on which he was working. The first hypothesis, the hypothesis according to which biological neurons, neuronal neurons, can be described and modeled as computing units, all or none units, as he was saying, 0, 1 units. Units that can have two states of activity, or 0 or 1, and which define their state of activity by performing logical operation on input signals, signals that they receive from other neurons of the same kind to which they are interconnected. It can be 0, 1 signal reflecting the state of activities of these neurons. And the second hypothesis is the hypothesis according to which all mental processes can be described, can be modeled in terms of neuronal activity generated in networks of or interconnections of this kind of neurons. So they can be modeled as fluxes of sequences of 0 and 1. And McCulloch started to make concrete the project of realizing this form of synthetic modeling of neuronal processes through a collaboration with Walter Pitts, a young mathematician, a collaboration that started in the early 40s and generated 2 articles that made the history of cybernetics, and in this sense also, in my view, of the cognitive sciences. The first article that they published in 1943, which is considered one of the seminal articles of cybernetics that opened the era of cybernetics, that was an article that strongly influenced von Neumann in his first draft, and so is considered at the basis of the development of computationalism. And then a second article based on a criticism that McCulloch Pitts developed with regard to the approach they proposed in the first article, and they proposed in this article in 1947, published in 1947, another approach, a different approach to the modeling of neuronal processes that influenced Heinz von Förster modeling of cognitive processes, and then Maturana and Varela, as I will try to show. The first of the articles I was referring to, the one published in 1943, is entitled A Logical Calculus of Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. And in this article, McCulloch and Pitts are formulating in a rigorous way the 2 hypotheses I was mentioning before. The hypothesis of ideal neurons, the idea that neurons can be described and modeled as functional units that are analog to Boolean operators, logical operations that are implementing operation, the Boolean logical operation like and, or, and so on, and which calculate their own state of activity by applying Boolean's logic rules to their input signals, as I indicated before. The second hypothesis is the hypothesis of networks of ideal neurons, the hypothesis according to which when this kind of neurons, this kind of models of biological neurons are interconnected in networks, they can implement specific complex Boolean functions. And the related computational activity produces the logical proposition that in the perspective of McCulloch and Pitts are constituting our mental life, whole our mental life, from perception to ideas to consciousness and so on. So in this article, through the development of this hypothesis and the proposal of this form of modeling for neuronal activity, McCulloch and Pitts were proposing an alternative to the classical philosophical view of the mind as a res cogitans, as an immaterial mind, a naked mind. The idea was that of proposing not a perspective on the mind that was describing the mind not anymore as a ghost in the machine, in the cerebral machine, but as a logical machine realized as a network of binary operation of computation. That is, the idea was that the mind can be studied at an empirical level through this kind of network when it's modeled in this way. And this kind of modeling projects an image of the cognitive mind not as a substance, but as a process, a dynamic, a collective entity that is immanent. This is the term they were using. That means distributed in or emerging from the computational activity of a population of neurons, as described before. And the idea was also that then cognitive processes can be conceptualized as processes of computation realized by networks of neurons, an idea that strongly influenced the computationalist view through the work of von Neumann. But just after the publication of this article, McCulloch and Pitts engaged in self-criticism. They developed a critical analysis of the approach, of the modeling approach they proposed in the article published in 1943, focusing on two key points. The first is the idea that biological neurons, different from the ideal neurons they described in this article, compute different Boolean functions, not only one of them, and work also in parallel, not only in series. And the second point was that the biological brain does not include predefined network to realize a specific Boolean function as they assumed in the 1943 articles. This idea is expressed by McCulloch in an essay that is called "Why is the Mind in the Head?", in which he says that due to the number of our neurons, we can inherit only the general scheme of the structure of our brains, but the rest must be left to chance. Chance includes experience, which engenders learning as the growing of new connections. Why is the mind in the head? And this here is proposing the thesis that will be reformulated by the future development of the tradition he started, because there and only here in the head, in the brain, are hosts of possible connections to be formed as time and circumstance demand. So on the basis of this critical analysis of the approach they proposed in 1943, in 1947, McCulloch and Pitts published another article, How We Know Universal, in which they propose a new approach that they label, that is typically labeled with the expression random networks. The idea is that modeling neuronal activity by developing networks with random connections between neurons. So the approach that we're proposing in 1943 was the approach of based on establishing a specific connection between the ideal neurons in order to test the capability of the networks constructed to perform specific cognitive tasks, to realize specific Boolean functions. Here the idea is different. The idea is that we have to connect randomly, not predefine the connection between the neurons, and then in order to be able to study the properties and the functions that are generated by the networks that we created in this way through the interaction with the environment in which we situate these networks, with a focus in this article on perception, where the target system for this kind of this new approach to the modeling of neuronal activity is the brain seen as an autonomous system, because here the idea is that the brain, as expressed in the fragment I read from McCulloch, determined by itself its own dynamics in interaction with the complex ecology in which it is immersed, that is the ecology of the body in which it is integrated, and the ecology of the environment in which the body is located. So we have with switching from this article, we have a radical shift in the modeling of nervous activity, from sequential to parallel operations of computation, from the emphasis on the input-output character of the network as models of the cognitive organization, the idea that what is important is the signal we introduce in the network and what comes out to test the capability of the networks to perform tasks that we predefined, to the reticular character of the networks, the idea that it's important to see how the connections that are autonomously developed in the network can create properties and functions, and a shift from cognitive processes conceived in terms of problem-solving processes to cognitive processes conceived as learning through interaction with the environment. And this is an approach that was developed in the context of the lab he founded at the Illinois University in the late 50s by Heinz von Förster, where the name of this lab is Biological Computer Lab, a lab in which with his team and this work, Heinz von Förster developed a position, an epistemological position that he labeled through the definition radical constructivism, and that we can consider an early version of radical embodiment approaches, where the idea of constructivism refer to the hypothesis characterizing this approach, according to which cognition cannot be conceptualized as a neutral representation of an independent reality that is independent from subjective contamination, but cognition has to be conceptualized as an adaptive function through which biological systems are actively creating, building, through the interaction with the environment and the other systems that are in the environment, a world of reference as a background for the recurrent interaction. And indeed, this name, Biological Computer Lab, is a name that contains a warning to the nascent computationalist cognitive science. This lab was founded in 1958, more or less. So the idea that through this name, Heinz von Förster wanted to deliver is the idea that the model of the computer, as it is applied in the context of computational, is misleading, not only because it eliminates from the perspective of the cognitive science the property of autonomy characterizing natural cognitive systems, but also because it leads to consider biological cognition as addressing extrinsic problem solving, that is, problems that are imposed to the system by the environment or by someone like the observer, the scientific observer. The idea that Heinz von Förster wanted to bring at the center of the attention of the cognitive science and the eye, that biological cognition is addressing the fundamental problem of all living systems, which is the problem of maintaining its own organization in an ever-changing, in hostile, as he called it, environment through processes of self-organization. And this is the mission of the Biological Computer Lab, that is producing a corrective for the model of the computer, that is the model of the biological computer. A biological alternative to the model of the computer articulated around the idea that biological systems as cognitive systems are characterized by the property of autonomy, conceptualized by Heinz von Förster in terms of self-organization. And the synthetic modeling approach that he uses to develop this alternative, this corrective to the model of the computer is the modeling approach developed in the context of the cybernetics of networks by McCulloch and Pitts, but the approach they developed in the article, they started to develop through the article published in 1947, the second of the articles I mentioned before. And the operation at the basis of the development of the position of radical constructivism is a reconfiguration of the Pitts-McCulloch model of network, the one proposed in 1947, on biological basis and mainly on the hypothesis that there is a continuity between life and cognition. The idea is proposed by Heinz von Förster is that the cognitive system is not the brain, but the whole living system, conceived as the network of processes of self-organization. And then the computation performed by cognitive system, by natural cognitive system as living systems, is every form of operation that a living system can realize and realizes to maintain itself, every operation involved in processes of self-organization. And this to move the notion of computation from the space of problem solving to the space of adaptive functions. And on the basis of this reconfiguration of the model of the network proposed by Pitts and McCulloch in 1947, Heinz von Förster proposes a new view of the cognitive science based, first of all, on a new version of the thesis of the immanence of the cognitive mind proposed by McCulloch and Pitts. The idea proposed by Heinz von Förster is that the cognitive mind emerges not only from brain activity, but from all processes of biological self-organization. So the cognitive mind is not in the head, as was advancing Warren McCulloch, is not in the brain, but in the whole biological network in the organism. And the mind as a process is a dynamic and distributed whole, given by all the computation that are realized by the subunits that we can distinguish as operating in living networks and participating to the processes of self-organization. So to this thesis, Heinz von Förster articulated a new development of the thesis of the reticularity of the cognitive organization proposed by McCulloch and Pitts through their models, and in particular the second of their models of neuronal activity. And this development consists of the thesis according to which the logical structure of computation is self-referentiality. If cognitive systems are networks of operations of computations, these operations are triggered by other cognitive operations and have impact on other cognitive operations. We are talking about closed networks of operations of computation. So the cognitive operations that are performed by biological systems as networks of operation of computation cannot refer to an external reality, a reality that would be external with regard to the organism, but they have to be conceptualized as eigenbehavior, that is operation that the network is performing on itself. From where the idea, the thesis according to which every operation of computation is a form of self-computation. And this reconceptualization of the notion of computation in this context is at the basis of the position of the epistemological radical constructivism that is developed by Heinz von Förster on the basis, if you want really to simplify, on the basis of two anti-computationalist theses. According to the first of these theses, a biological organism conceived as a biological computer, a biological cognitive system, and conceptualized in terms of a networks of operation of self-computation, is informationally closed and thermodynamically open. So we are talking here about a closed network of operation of self-computation, that is of self-organization. We don't have in this form of organization any input device through which the system could receive predefined information from the environment. The way in which the system interacts with the environment is given by the possibility of perceiving some of the environmental events as perturbations, alteration of its processes of self-organization, and reacting to this perturbation when these perturbations are not structural perturbation and not damaging the organizational link among the parts, the components of the living system, reacting to this perturbation through dynamics of self-regulation that we observe in biological systems and are directed to compensate, to eliminate the perturbative effect. So basically the idea is that both the cognitive system, the biological system and the environment are self-organized systems. Operational, they are independent, but they are thermodynamically open. They exchange energy and matter that both need to sustain, to support their processes of self-organization. And through their interaction, being operationally independent, they perturbate each other and trigger in each other processes of endogenous self-regulation, which Heinz von Förster interprets as processes of creation of information. The idea is that a biological computer does not process predefined information, but create information. That is, it associates through its activity of self-regulation in presence of environmental perturbation, it associates environmental events, so these perturbations, to schemes of self-regulation, that is, schemes of activities of self-regulation that allow the system to maintain its organization in the environmental conditions that are given in this perturbative, when there are these perturbative events, which means in its perspective that the system generates operational meanings that are expressed in terms of schemes of self-regulation for the environmental events that it can perceive as a perturbation, which means that this system is a system that builds a meaningful reality, a reality that's meaningful from the point of view of its operation linked to the maintenance of its organization, a meaningful reality of reference, while interactive with an environment that in itself is a perturbative background. And many aspects of the Heinz von Foerster approach to the modeling of cognitive processes and to the modeling of cognitive systems are convergent with the kind of modeling that is produced by Maturana and Varela in the context of the development of the theory of autopoiesis or the autopoietic cognitive biology. And this autopoietic cognitive biology was developed by Maturana and Varela in close interaction with Heinz von Foerster. The so-called first draft of the autopoiesis was written by Maturana in the form of a report of the research visit that Maturana made in the biological computer lab directed by Heinz von Foerster. And if this already says a lot about the connection between Maturana and Varela to the tradition of experimental epistemology, we have also to consider that concerning Varela, we have a lot of indications or references to experimental epistemology as is general research approach of reference. But for what concerns Maturana, we have an indication by the same McCulloch. McCulloch individuating the team directed by Letwin that participated to the neurophysiological studies that produced the famous article, What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, a team in which Maturana was involved. McCulloch, in an essay he wrote in 1961, individuating in this work one of the best expressions of the research tradition of experimental epistemology. It is a research tradition that intends to address classical question of philosophy of knowledge based on empirical research characterized by the application of the synthetic method, which is what also Maturana and Varela are doing in the context of the development of the theory of autopoiesis, which is conceived by Maturana and Varela as a theoretical framework that can generate answers for two questions that can be addressed jointly. The main question of the sciences of life, that is, what is life? And the main question of the cognitive sciences, that is, what is cognition? And the possibility of treating jointly these two questions is given by an hypothesis that they share with Heinz von Foerster, that is the hypothesis of a continuity between life and cognition that is expressed in this first draft by Maturana I was referring before, through the famous sentence according to which living systems are cognitive systems and living as a process is a process of cognition. And the work of generation of answers for these two questions, what is life, what is cognition, produced by Maturana and Varela in the context of the development of autopoiesis, is based on two hypotheses that are refined versions of hypotheses that we already find in the production by Heinz von Foerster. The idea that life and cognition are both expressions of the distinctive property of biological system that also Maturana and Varela identify as autonomy and define in terms of autopoiesis, meaning referring with that to a specific form of self-production that is allows biological system through metabolism to produce and maintain their own material identity. And here they use the term autopoiesis because they intend to dismiss the term self-organization. It would be very complex. It's impossible now to go into details about that, but the main idea is that they consider that the organization is the invariant of the dynamics. So the term self-organization would be misleading to describe the autonomous dynamics of biological system. That's why they introduced the idea of autopoiesis. And the second hypothesis is the idea that the specific form of autonomy of biological system, autopoiesis, does not depend from single components in the organisms, in the living system, or localized organizational centers in these systems, but relies on the organization that is interconnecting all the components constituting living system in the dynamic unit of the organism. From this hypothesis derives the idea that to answer this question, what is life and what is cognition, is necessary to define the form of organization that is characteristic of biological system, because it's the form of organization that is generating and supporting the specific form of autonomy of this system that is described by the notion of autopoiesis, which is something that Maturana and Varela do through a theoretical application of the synthetic method. In The Tree of Knowledge, one of their books, they describe the scientific procedure through which they arrive to define the autopoietic organization, the organization of biological system, in these terms. Our goal is to proceed scientifically. If you can't make a list that characterizes a living system, why not propose a system that, as it works, produces its entire phenomenology? So, and the idea is that of switching from the classical analytical approach that in the context of the sciences of life is applied to the definition of life, making a list of properties of characterizing living systems, where the scientific community does not converge in a list of this kind, switching towards a synthetic approach that is defining theoretically a mechanism that can produce the entire living phenomenology, and that maybe can be then implemented in an artifact to be tested. So the notion of autopoiesis has this task, defining theoretically a mechanism that is able to generate the whole living phenomenology, which in the perspective of Maturana and Varela includes also the cognitive phenomenology and also the social phenomenology. All the phenomenology of the biological, the cognitive, and the social domains, as we know it, included the possibility of the scientific observers of the creators of the theory of autopoiesis, which is something that Maturana and Varela do at the level of the minimal cell, in the sense that they consider that we have enough knowledge to define these mechanisms for what concerns the minimal life, the basic unit of life, that is the cell. And this, in a sense, is enough, because the cell does not have the cell has the basic form of biological organization. They individuate three main forms of biological organization, that is the cellular form, the multicellular form, and the form characterizing social aggregates. But they recognize that the multicellular form of the biological organization and the social aggregates form of biological organization are deriving evolutionary from the cellular form of biological organization. And not only, they include this form of organization because multicellular and social aggregates include cells. So the idea is that of defining the mechanism at this level and then testing the capability of this mechanism, conceptually testing the capability of this mechanism to generate all the whole living and cognitive phenomenology as we know it, which is something they do in detail in the Tree of Knowledge, and something that also many specialists in the sciences of the artificial are trying to do through the construction of artifacts. And the notion of autopoiesis or autopoietic organization they develop is the one I present in this slide. As you will see, it's a quite complex notion. We will not go into details about this notion. The main aspect for us, the most important aspect for us, is that this notion reproposes in a new form the descriptive schemes that is characterizing the tradition, the research tradition of experimental epistemology, that is the descriptive scheme of the network that is applied in this case at the cellular level. That is, they describe in this notion cellular metabolism as a network of operation of production and destruction of components that is realized by a population of components in interaction, where the operations are not described as operations of computation, and the components are not described as computational units. So I read the definition just to give you an idea. Autopoietic organization is a network of processes of production, that is transformation and destruction of components. This is biological cellular metabolism that produces the components which, through their interaction and transformation, continually regenerate and realize the network of processes. So we have a network of processes that is realizing the components that, when are realized, retrigger relationship of production between them that are regenerating the network, and on this basis constitute a concrete unit in the space in which they exist, specifying the topological domain of the realization of the network through the interposition of the boundary, the cellular membrane. So we can consider this notion, we can interpret this notion as a transformative development of von Förster's approach to the description of cognitive systems that declines the idea that in a very decided way, declines the idea of cognitive system as computing networks, the idea that was characterizing the developments of the tradition of experimental epistemology, also in the phase of second-order cybernetics. So we have here a radical rejection of the matter of the computer that makes of the model of the autopoietic system not a corrective of the model of the computer, as in the case of the biological computer proposed by Hans von Förster, the self-organizing system proposed by Hans von Förster, but a radical alternative to this model. So basically what the notion of autopoiesis is proposing, is describing, is a basic form of living and cognitive organization that can be not in any form described in terms characterizing as a computer, because it is a network of metabolic operation of destruction and transformation of components, which realizes a unit capable of self-production, self-maintenance, and self-individuation, self-distinction from an environment, as I said, through the interposition of a border of the cellular membrane, in the case of the cell. So what this notion is bringing on the theoretical scene is the process of production of a minimal body in an environment of preference, because this system, while self-distinguishing itself from the environment, is also distinguishing and defining an environment of reference for its interaction. And the basis of this characterization of biological systems as cognitive system through the notion of autopoiesis, Maturana and Varela propose a new view of the cognitive mind that expresses a new version of the thesis of the immanence of the cognitive mind, the thesis of the reticularity of the cognitive organization, typical of the experimental epistemology tradition, without any reference to computationalist notions. So the thematization of cognition in the context of the theory of autopoiesis is articulated around the notion of structural coupling, which is a notion that explicit what was already there in the description realized by Hans von Förster of the interaction between a cognitive system, a biological cognitive system, and the environment. The idea of a structural coupling is the idea of a symmetric interaction, a symmetric relationship between the cognitive system and which interaction and its environment, which is a relationship of reciprocal perturbation and endogenously generated compensation activities of self-regulation in the other system. So this is the idea that is reproposed by structural coupling. So cognition is thematized in terms of generation of meanings for perceived perturbation, and more specifically in terms of co-construction of a meaningful world from the side of the cognitive system in interaction with the environment and other systems. And indeed, they define cognition as effective action that is enabling a living being, a living system to continue its existence in a definite environment as it brings forth a meaningful world, or a co-action, an action that first of all is the action of production of itself in interaction with the environment and with other systems, that brings forth a shared with the environment, with the other system, a meaningful world from a perturbative background, where the notion of structural coupling, by being the central notion of the thematization of cognition, and being a notion that refers to the relationship between the system and the environment, is a notion that poses at the basis of cognition as creation of meaning, creation of a meaningful world, a complex cognitive network. That is, while in computationalism, as the cognitive process is a cognitive process of information processing that can be confined in the central unit of the system that is modeled in this way. In the case of the autopoietic description of the cognitive process as a process of the generation of meaning, which is grounded in the activity of self-regulation triggered by also by the environment, the cognitive process cannot be confined in the autopoietic system or in some parts of the autopoietic system, but is a process that involves densely the environment. That is a radical interdependence between the processes of self-regulation of the autopoietic system that are generating meanings and the processes that are the processes characterizing the environment. We cannot distinguish between them. So implicitly, what the idea of the cognitive mind that through this conceptualization of cognition based on the notion of structural coupling, autopoiesis is proposing is a distributed view of the mind. It's the idea that the mind is not in the head, is not in the individual organism, but is distributed. And in this sense, McCulloch would say is immanent in, is distributed in, is emerging from the networks that are involving the structural coupling, that is the network supporting the autopoietic system and the network supporting its ecology. And in this sense, the idea is that we can start to think to the cognitive mind as extended to the whole biosphere, which is implicit in the theory of autopoiesis, but is explicit in some of the articles that Varela is writing already in the 70s, in particular in an article from 1973. And this is a view that Varela is even deepening and intensifying in principles of biological autonomy, where he's suggesting that the mind is not in the head nor in the individual organism, but is in the whole ecology of autonomy. That is the ensemble of all autonomous systems, not only strictly biological system, that can be individuated by an observer at different level of a reality of reference. It's referring to families, ecosystem, economies, managerial complex nations, clubs. Indeed, and I stop in a few minutes, in principles of biological autonomy, Varela is addressing the problems of the limits of autopoiesis, the fact that autopoiesis offers a concrete alternative to the model of the computer only at the level of the cell, only at the cellular level, a level that is quite marginal for scientific inquiries on cognition. So the tension with the computationalist model rigorously can be organized only at this level. And what about the other levels? This is the question. Families, ecosystem, economies, managerial complexes, nations, clubs, how are we to deal with this variety of autonomous systems? And it's in this sense, at the beginning, I was saying that Varela was already watching in the direction of the crisis that we could meet through a computationalist view of cognitive processing, a computationalist way of thinking, and is offering through these modeling tools that are enabling us to describe all system that can be conceived not as representationalist system, but as systems that are generating meanings, as autonomous system. Many systems that are not strictly biological, but still are manifesting a form of autonomy, in this sense, a form of cognitive interaction with the environment. So the problem with regard to this issue becomes, in principles of biological autonomy, modeling the organization that is shared by all autonomous systems. And the solution is that of proposing a new version of the model of the network, which is a sort of a generalization of the notion of autopoietic organization. I will not enter in detail here. I will offer here a definition of this model that in principles of biological autonomy is called conversational unit by Francisco Varela, a definition that he gives later in 1995 in an article entitled Emergent Self, in which the definition is an underlying circular process elicits an emergent coherence, and this is the cognitive self at that level. So here we have a generic model that defines the organizational traits that are shared by all autonomous systems. We have a reticular process, a network of components that he will conceptualize in principles of biological autonomy through the notion of closure introduced by Piaget, that generate the emergence of a unit that he defines as a self, as a self that is distributed is in this reticular process that interacts cognitively with its environment through a form of coupling, an activity of self-regulation that is an activity of creation of a meaningful word of reference for its recurrent interaction. And this generic model is declinable in a variety of specific models at different levels of the autonomous organization. So it is a tool to describe different kinds of systems that show a dimension of autonomy in this term through this kind of description. And is the basis of, in my view, of a further evolution of the concept of the cognitive mind that is elaborated in the context of experimental epistemology. Because here the mind is described as a plural process, a dynamic, collective, polycentric, metamorphic entity, metamorphic process that is distributed in all autonomous systems and their units of coevolution, their structural coupling that calling this model conversational units equals dialogues or conversation, and is always open to evolution towards new levels of autonomous of organization. And this view, according to which the cognitive mind is not in the head, is not in the individual organism, not simply in the whole biosphere, but in the whole ecology of autonomy, is presented through these words in the principles of biological autonomy. I'm using the word mind here in the sense of cognitive processes of what is proper to sentient beings and not of consciousness, awareness of or soul. Whatever we call human mind in human affairs as a similarity to processes that are distributed in nature in autonomous organization. That there are differences with the human experience, no doubt. I am speaking here not of the differences, but of the continuity. Such continuity has often been claimed, but always with regard in the best Cartesian skull-bound tradition. With Bateson and Maturana, I am suggesting that this continuity goes beyond that to encompass the cognitive process of every system that acquires an autonomous structure beyond the single biological individual. This not only gives an entirely different picture of what biosphere and ecology are, but also of what social interactions and traditions are. And in principles of biological autonomy, claiming that this view of mind and nature is perhaps the most interesting and yet the most immature of the thoughts that flow from the study of autonomy. And he must leave it in this book in this very rough form. But I think that the following research activity is always considering the development of this view of mind. And so the enactive approach is also expressing an expression of this view of mind, that the mind is an immanent quality of a class of organization, including individual living systems, but also ecological aggregates, social units of various sorts, brains, conversation, and many others, however spatially distributed or short-lived. There is mind in every unit engaged in conversation-like in structural coupling interactions. So I thank you very much for your attention and for your patience for this long and very dense presentation. And I would like to invite you to share your motivation for being here, your experience in this first session through a keyword, a sentence, an image, a reflection. First of all, in the breakout groups that we will have now for more or less 15 minutes. And then maybe also in the Slack channel, where I will post some material, the slides of this introduction, but also some material stimulating discussion with regard to the topic that I presented. And as we hope that you will post your questions about this, because today we will not have the time to discuss based on your questions, but surely in the next sessions and in the last session we will do. So thank you very much again, and let's go towards the breakout groups.
Thank you so much, Luisa. So we're going to have 15 minutes for these breakout groups. There will be about 7 to 8 people in each group. Each group will have a sort of facilitator or moderator, one of the team members from the organization. And at the end, when we come back to the main room, we'd love to ask one of the participants in the group to just summarize really briefly some of the key words that came out of your discussion. So whether they relate to your motivations for being here, or maybe some guiding questions that brought you into this particular series and you'd like to see discussed later on in the session. So I'm going to open the rooms and you can join your breakout rooms and come back in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. It looks like most everyone has come back from the breakout rooms at this point. So we don't have that much time left. So being aware of time, we'd love to just hear from one participant from each group. If you could just very succinctly bring forward a few keywords about the motivations that came up, maybe some of the backgrounds, different people's backgrounds that inform their motivations, maybe a question or two that came up, but maybe just keep it to about a minute or a minute and a half if possible. So if someone from group 1 could come, I think group 1 was with John Protevi. So anyone who is in John Protevi's group.
Well, some of my folks were a little reluctant to want to speak, but we did come up with a couple of keywords. One was emergence. These were more like desires for further clarification as the course goes on. The other one was on varieties of computation. So we had the classical linear computation and then this connectionist model. And the last one was about the ways in which at the very end of the presentation, we had a kind of multiplication of minds, such that there were many more minds than one would think if we kept human intelligence as the center or the model of how things work. But instead, we can move towards a whole variety of different cognitive systems. So that kind of multiplication at the end, that struck some people as interesting.
Great, thank you. Okay, how about group 2? People who are in Amy's group, Amy Varela's group. Maybe a participant could come forward.
I'll be happy to share. So we had a quite wide variety of backgrounds from philosophy, education, poetry, arts, and all kinds of research. And some of the keywords that came up in our group were adventure, joy, conversation, crisis, the enactive approach as a way out, co-creation, expansion, fun, creativity, change, modeling of perturbations and compensations, if I got that right, participation, community, creation, excitement, sources, and evolution. And it was great. Great.
And happy birthday, because we have a birthday today.
Oh, happy birthday.
Marsha, yeah.
Marsha. Great.
Thank you.
So anyone who that was in group 3, then we'll move on to Valerie's group.
If anyone wants to talk, or I do it, I do it, okay. So we had several keywords: interconnectedness, but also increasing strength in understanding enaction, but not only on the theoretical point of view, but also how to implement it. There is also need to acquire skill and possibly, you know, enlarge theoretical thinking for a PhD, so very concrete things, but also interconnectivity and creativity has been also mentioned, and rethinking dualism. I'm just checking if I haven't. No, I think it's more or less in a keyword fashion what we were discussing.
Great, thank you, Valérie. And then group 4, Gabor's group.
Thanks, Joanna. Anyone would like to share from our group? Jose or Julia or others? If not, I can share the keywords I took notes of. It was an interesting group, very diverse, actually 2 artists, dancers, neuroscientist, and one working with 4E cognition in Mexico, and one interested in ecopsychology. So the keywords were reconnection, ecopsychology, very much content put into practice in various areas, dynamic ways to put these ideas into action. So action came up, reorientation of perception and perspective, becoming free from cognitivism, social interaction, and deepening knowledge of the enactive approach. And some questions were also gathered that I will share with Luisa after the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Group 5, so Luisa's group.
My group was empty, so I was alone. There were 2 people, but we were not connected.
I was thrust into group 5. Somewhat to my surprise, but let me offer, if anyone from group 5 would care to jump in and characterize our discussion, or I'd be happy to do it. So okay, we had a mixture of people, although there was some, maybe a couple of clinicians, definitely people interested in the psychological ramifications, but also in what was not mentioned really directly in Luisa's presentation today because of its genealogical slant. It was sort of the ultimate, sort of the Buddhistic side of where the conversation will be going. Some of our folks especially interested in that. But I took from our participant Enrico, the phrase he used was the more complex networks, that is sort of the biological sort of foundations that were rehearsed today are fascinating, but it's really when we move out to the psychological and sociological levels of organization, that's the what the seemed to be a dominant key concern for Group 5. Clinical possibilities. As a practical matter, how might someone find in this material ideas that can help help people get on with their lives, which I think probably we all share at some level of our concern. And I thought it was fascinating, that we're talking about mind as emergent from networks, which is sort of the trajectory of what we heard today, but what if you turn it around, and what if it is from mind that the world emerges? And so these were sort of horizons of anticipation, I think I registered in the conversation that we had.
Thank you. I like that, horizons of anticipation. I think we had some of those as well in our group. So group 6, Rocio, do you want to share some of the different?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. To make it really short, basically there were 7 of us, and with very different backgrounds, from communication, nurse, resolution of conflict. I'm a biochemist, and cognitive sciences, and very, very large scope of expertise. And basically what we were all looking for is that we are some people more, some people less familiar with the Francisco Varela's ideas and the enactive embodiment movement, let's say, but there's always kind of a gap on what, trying to make sense, that intuitively it makes sense, but there's something that we can grasp finally. And the other movement would be to have the, as Johanna said, but I don't remember it quite right, but to have the methodology to put it, to make a concrete project, let's say, or to put it, down to earth, and to, in our different specialties, to put it into action, or, well, I guess you know what I mean, basically. That's it.
Great, thank you, Rocio. Wonderful, thank you to everyone. And so I think we'll turn it back to Luisa just for a couple of closing words to lead us into the next session on September 28th.
Yes, so just to say that the next session, as anticipated, is a session in which we will have as invited speaker Bruno Clark. So will be a session dedicated to the cybernetics origin of enaction. So I don't know if, Bruno, you want to say something about this session, just to prepare.
Sure. Well, after your talk today, I said, well, okay. You went into it at quite some depth, but I will be my focus will be Heinz von Förster, a fascinating character, very important for Francisco's development, very crucial. He and Maturana formed a very close friendship and working relationship in the 1960s. And then when Francisco went to study at Harvard and get his doctorate there at the end of the 60s, he had the support network of von Förster at the Biological Computer Lab. So von Förster, so this is it's a convenient way to focus this, what Luisa drew out as the series of conceptual events that laid a kind of foundation, but a foundation that then had to be surpassed and worked to some extent away from as well as upon and that's certainly how I understand the trajectory of what Luisa laid out today, but we'll go back and look at some blast from the past, look at some specific crucial articles and open them up just a little bit. So it'll be very much a historical, genealogical presentation focused on Heinz von Förster and the Biological Computer Laboratory.
So thank you very much. We cannot wait to see your presentation. And so I think, Joanna, maybe we can now close this introductory session. would like to thank you, everybody, really.
Thank you
Yes,
so
thank
much.
you so much, everyone. Go ahead.
Thank you, Johanna. Sorry, Johanna. Thank you so much, Luisa, for your offering.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Luisa, and thanks to everyone. And please continue posting questions you have on Slack. And Luisa will also be providing some of her materials as well on the Slack, so we can have some continuity between now and September 28th. So see you at the same time, 6 p.m. Central European Summer Time on September 28th.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.